Again, my name is Bianca Monzon, and I'm a data project manager on the Child and Family Data Archive. The Child and Family Data Archive is supported by a contract from OPRE, housed by ICPSR within the University of Michigan. It is the place to discover, access, and analyze data on young children, their families and communities, and the programs that serve them. Users are able to access over 300 data sets with the ability to analyze only selected data sets online. Users can also search and compare variables and peruse data-related publications. And of course, there's user support available to assist users in finding and obtaining data. So the website is CF Data's main public interface, and it's through the website that researchers, policymakers, and other users can explore the data, learn more about the child care and early education research, and discover training opportunities presented by CF Data. And we encourage you guys to explore our website on your own to learn more about the available data and resources. The website is also where you will go to access the AIAN FACES data. So to do that, you would visit the Child and Family Data Archive website at childandfamilydataarchive.org. And then to find the study, you're just going to enter the study title or acronym in the search box that's highlighted here in the red oval and hit return. On the search results page, you're going to click on the AIAN FACES study title. So here we have the AIAN 2015 study displaying, and then that's going to connect you to the study homepage. So this is a screenshot of the 2015 study homepage for the AIAN study. The homepage is where you'll be able to access the data, but also see important information about the study in like a summary format. So the study homepage opens with the At a Glance tab that's active and highlighted by the red oval on the left. And this is where you'll find a summary about the data and information on the study's design, sampling, data collection period, and more. The study homepage is also where users can search and view publications based on the use of the AIAN FACES data. And so you would see the data-related publications tab that's highlighted by the red oval on the right. We encourage researchers to read other publications that have already been published from the analysis of these data. That usually helps with your own research. Also on the study homepage, as you scroll down on the At a Glance tab, are the restrictions and special requirements for requesting access to the AIAN FACES data. So please follow the information presented here, including reading carefully the application guide, the best practices for working with the AIAN FACES data, and the AIAN FACES data application protocol. Sara will present more on these and the special requirements in just a few minutes. Using the variable search tab on the study homepage, highlighted by the red oval, users can also explore the data at variable level. Here, users can search for and compare variables within the FACES data. Simply enter words or strings that relate to your measures of interest in the search box highlighted, and the search will return a list of variables related to your search terms, including information, the variable name, label question, if available, variable type, and associated data sets. The variable level search feature is another great way to identify variables of interest, in addition to exploring the study codebook, user guide, and other documentation before you go through the process of requesting access to these data. On the Data and Documentation tab, you can download the individual documentation files. Now, since the AIAN FACES data are restricted access, only the documentation can be downloaded on this tab. You're also able to preview the study user guide and codebooks before downloading the documentation to your computer. To download all the documentation files at one time, you can also use the download drop-down menu highlighted above the Data and Documentation tab. While users may preview and download the public documentation located on the Data and Documentation tab, a restricted data application is required for users to gain access to the restricted data and all of the study documentation. All of the files in the AIAN FACES data are restricted use, and that's to protect the privacy of study respondents. So to begin your application, you would click on the Access Restricted Data button highlighted up in the right, and then follow the instructions and complete the sections that are shown next. When you click on that button, a window is going to appear displaying the guidelines for applying for restricted data shown above. So the first paragraph and special requirements paragraph are the same information that you can find in the restrictions field on the At a Glance tab that I highlighted earlier. But this box also identifies general requirements to accessing the data. So again, we're going to need a project description, IRB approval letter, security plan, and more that will need to be provided through the online application portal. Remember, AIAN FACES has special requirements for researchers interested in accessing these data, and these requirements also need to be met. There are general requirements and items that must be submitted with the application. So then once you read through this and read through all of the materials that are required by researchers to access the data, you can go ahead and click next. And then you will be taken directly to the application to request the AIAN FACES data. You can download and read the data use agreement before you begin, and then just remember to visit the Child and Family Data Archive website to request access to the data. And if you experience any issues with completing your application, or if you have general questions about the study, you can email us at cfdata-help@umich.edu with your questions. So before I turn it back over to Sarah, I just want to circle back to two questions that have kind of been raised, one during this session and one during our 10 a.m. session. I know that we received a question about requesting access to the AIAN 2019 data. So currently, as you're maybe aware, the AIAN 2019 data are currently not available through the Child and Family Data Archive, so we are working to make them available, expected sometime later this fall. However, there's a lot of documents and application checkpoints that you can kind of start before the data get released, such as our restricted data use agreement, which Sarah was going to go into a little bit more, I believe. And so you can just shoot us an email at, again, cfdata-help@umich.edu. Let us know that you're interested in gaining access to the AIAN FACES 2019 data, and let us know that you would like to start the application process, and we can share some of the materials that are available. So again, working with your institution to get the restricted data use agreement signed off can sometimes be a lengthy process. So I think it's a great idea to get that started before the data are released. You may also be able to work on your IRB letter and things like that. I know that we'll also be talking about a committee letter that's needed, and I would say for that requirement, I would wait until the data are up so that you can explore the data and what's inside the data, because you're going to need that information when developing those materials. So I can't really see the chat box. I don't know if I'm getting any questions.
I don't think there are any available.
There is a, yeah, there is a, I'm sorry. What was that?
Okay, great.
Yeah, so there was a question. I don't know if you see that.
Go, Jessica.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions. One question is the survey questionnaire available online? We'll start with that one. That might be one.
Yeah, so I don't recall seeing the survey questionnaire available online. I think if it's part of the user guide, it should be, but I can double check.
Yeah.
Sorry that I don't.
I think sorry to interrupt, but if the full user's manual, including all the appendices, are downloadable online, then you should be able to see them there. And I think that I think that they are, but don't hold me.
Yeah, that is going to be available then, and you can preview that without having to download any of the documentation. I'm sorry, because we also sometimes will release survey instruments separate from user guide, so I would have to remember which studies have it appended in their user guide. But yeah, I would recommend just going to the study homepage and seeing what documentation is available, because I think for AIAN, again, we have codebook, the user guide, which also includes the survey instruments, and also looking at the 2015 documents that kind of help guide you through the process can kind of give you an idea of what to expect for the 2019 data. So I really recommend reviewing those materials now.
Nancy also had a question about, would you repeat the email address to use if they want to get started on the application early?
Sure, so it's cfdata-help@umich.edu. That's CF as in Frank, data-help umich.edu. And again, you'll want to indicate like this is for the AIAN data, and then you kind of want to, the AIAN 2019 data, and that you want to kind of get started on your application. I also wanted to circle back to another question that kind of came up earlier, and I probably should have jumped in, but I didn't want to interrupt, and I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. So I think someone else was asking about requesting the data at a variable level. And again, ICPSR delivers the files, and the Child Family Data Archive delivers the files at a file level, right? So that goes for the 2015 data and for the 2019 data. And again, if you have any questions or concerns about that, feel free to shoot us an email.
So I just want to be clear, ask a follow-up question, make sure it's really clear. So at this point, because it has switched over since initially there was a different process, or there was a different system in place, right? But so currently you say at the file level, so that means the entire, anyone who applies gets the entire data file?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay.
That's correct.
So that is
That's
different
correct.
than what it was, which was you would only get the variables that you requested. And
I'll have to check in.
Clarify that with the data committee too, which, because again, we had a review yesterday or a follow-up meeting for a review yesterday, and that we were still talking like that's the way it is. So I think we need to be more clear.
Yes, I can touch base with Kay, and I think we can probably follow up as well after. But I think, yeah, it's going to be at a file level. And for the AIAN 2019 data that has, again, 2 different files, you would have to specify getting access and your reasons for wanting access before we just give you both of the files. So I think if there aren't any other questions, I'm now going to turn it back to Sara.
And while
so I'm going to share a little bit more about how to access and really apply for the data on behalf of colleagues at OPRE who are funding the study. Okay, so making sure that AIAN FACES data were available for secondary use was a strong priority of the work group, which we talked about this morning. Requirements for access to the data are based on agreements that have been made between the data collection team at Mathematica and the tribal IRBs and review committees governing communities where the data was collected. So these reviews are intended to assist researchers to use the data with consideration for the context from which they came. The feedback that the data committee provides is intended to aid researchers. And Jessica and I have both referenced the data committee, and that sort of piece of the puzzle will become clear in the next several slides. But the feedback that committee gives is intended to aid the researcher. It's not intended to infringe in any way on academic freedom or limit researchers to a specific line of inquiry. Tribal review of some kind is standard operating procedure in most, if not all, tribal research partnerships. And so this requirement aligns with best practices for conducting research with Native communities. The required review of any publication or presentation using AIAN FACES data is not meant to replace peer review that would be done by a journal or professional conference in advance of accepting a manuscript or presentation. The process is really intended to ensure that first, the AIAN FACES data are used accurately and appropriately and only by qualified researchers. Second, that tribal input is taken into account when interpreting and reporting findings from the study. Third, that tribal programs and communities have access to the findings and information about how the data are being used and by whom. And fourth, that participant privacy and data confidentiality are protected. Okay. So the agreement of collaboration and participation is a document where we specified what was being asked of the communities and what Mathematica's, I've been talking too much, what was asked of communities and what Mathematica was going to do. So things like working with the Administration for Children and Families, Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation, and members of the AIAN FACES work group to ensure that future analyses of the AIAN FACES data are done accurately and recognize the uniqueness of tribal communities and peoples. So to do that, things like having data training seminars like today on how to accurately and ethically analyze and report on Region 11 children and families. That there would be a restricted use data set created that would be available to qualified researchers, that all personally identifiable information would be stripped from the data set, including names and tribal affiliations of all study participants, and that the identity of study programs and participating communities would also be removed from the file. Access to the data are only granted to individuals from institutes of higher education and research organizations. Communities may have access to the data through partnerships with these individuals and organizations by requesting special tabulations and analyses, or sorry, by partnering or by requesting special tabulations and analyses, I should say. Individuals requesting access will be required to submit an analysis plan for how they'll use the data. So that's where we started to talk about variables you'd use, that sort of thing. Evidence that their plan has been reviewed by an institutional review board or IRB, participate in a training on appropriate and inappropriate uses of the data, and on conducting research on tribal programs and peoples, and also applicants need to sign a confidentiality pledge, agreeing to protect the privacy and confidentiality of study participants. Let's see, make sure I'm not. So when working with tribal communities, the research process is not just about individuals, right, but about the community as a participant in the study. So informed consent and approval takes a broader level for data protections and agreements from communities in the study for data ownership and data use. AIAN FACES established an approach to try to honor tribal best practices for conducting research, but determining also a way to support data use, given that we have 22 different programs. This is on a national scale. Okay, voila, the data committee. So the data committee is a critical element of the data access agreements with communities participating in the study, and it aligns with tribal review practices when conducting research with tribal communities. In place of each tribal IRB reviewing applications for access to the data. So imagine wanting to use this data and having to apply separately to 22 governing bodies or IRBs. It might seem like a lot of steps here, but there's one, one place, and this is part of what this process is trying to take the place of. So in place of 22 different reviews, that will come from the data committee. So reviewing applications for access, reviewing publications and presentations, and giving feedback. Again, those reviews are really intended to help researchers use the data correctly so that findings from their analyses are accurate and the conclusions that are being drawn are supported with the data, but also appropriately reflect context. Okay, so data transparency. There's also a goal of the study to share findings back with the programs and communities. So for the current products that the study team is preparing, so in the past it was Mathematica and the TRC. You know, this round so far, Mathematica has been working on products, and I'm sure as soon as the data comes out, others will be as well. But the study team has really been working with the work group on the best ways to share findings back with Head Start staff, parents, and tribal leaders. The Child and Family Data Archive maintains a list or archive with free access to thousands of publications and data sets. That includes many of the Administration for Children and Families funded studies such as FACES and now also AIAN FACES. Okay, so data access requirements and procedures. Okay, so I've mentioned this a bit earlier, but just to reinforce, the committee's role is really to review and provide feedback and not to deny access. The review and conditions of use are, again, really intended as a help to researchers to use the data correctly, and so that findings from the analyses are accurate and their conclusions can be supported with the data and their methods that they're proposing. And again, it's intended, this is in the notes law, but it's intended as a help and not to infringe on any kind of academic freedoms or limit certain lines of inquiry. Okay, I'm going to try and walk through this. It's a lot to look at first, but moving left to right, these are the data access steps. So visit the AIAN FACES study page. Bianca was screen sharing that before. Look at the application and access instructions. Applicants need to read and acknowledge the best practices for AIAN FACES data. They need to submit a research plan to the data committee via email. And then they need to begin an online application at the Child and Family Data Archive. So once that research plan is submitted, it will go to the data committee. Typically, the full data committee doesn't review applications. It's usually like 2 or 3 members. They review the research plan. They make a recommendation about, I think, whether to grant access or things that they might like to see before granting access. And then a letter is sent back to the researcher, either showing or letting them know that they've met the requirements for access, or that they need to do a few more things before access is granted. So if the requirements are not met, the researcher can then revise and resubmit their plan to the committee. If the requirements are met, or once they're met, after revising and resubmitting, the applicant would submit the online application through the Child and Family Data Archive system, and including the data committee letter. This is where, for AIAN FACES 2019, in that letter, there should be mention of, this applicant should either have the main file, or they should have the main file and this partial sample file with that limited spring 2020 data. So anyway, that would all go into the archive. That would, Child and Family Data Archive would make sure the application is complete, and then assuming that it is, deliver the data to the researcher, where there's a term of use for up to 2 years, where either the data use agreement needs to be renewed for continued use, or if there's not the data is not needed for continued use, then the researcher would need to provide the archive with an affidavit of data destruction. I see some people coming back on video who are also involved in this process. So Jessica and Bianca, I hope you have insights to add.
I did have something to add. It's not a formal part of the process, which is why you don't see it probably reflected here, but we have, and it's new, we just started doing this, where in addition to providing that review, that written feedback, we're offering that the research team applying meet with the review committee to talk through those recommendations. And so that's what I kept referring to. That was we had that first meeting with a research team applying for AIAN FACES 2015 data just yesterday. So, we got the written feedback to the team and offered to meet with them. The team said, yes, we'd like to meet with you. And then we had that meeting. So it's not a formal part of the process, but it's something that we're offering. And I really think that is going to help research teams kind of understand that feedback, because the feedback may seem kind of make a lot of sense to us, because this is what we've been doing for a long time, but there are a lot of questions that teams may have. So it's offered to be a support, not a barrier.
Not another hoop.
Not another hoop.
Yeah.
It's not a time for you to come on and explain why your work is important. It's just a time for us to make sure that our recommendations, that you understand them, that they make sense, and talk through any supports that we can provide.
Anyone else involved with the process or who's been through it want to add anything? Bianca, you might be double muted if you're.
I am double muted. This is technical difficulties when I'm calling in by my phone. I would say that we're also not any for AIN at the moment, but I know for other studies, there's been some concerns about completing the affidavit of destruction, especially with COVID happening and being able to get access to a notary. And I would just say if you were have any concerns or questions about that process, again, just reach out to us via email. We'll work with you to figure it out, especially as we know more people are transitioning back into their institutions and their organizations, but a lot of people are still working from home. The same should be said about the application process and the required, the data security requirements for working with the data, that there is a lot of questions that have been coming up, right? If users are using the data from home, you're going to kind of see reflected in the data application that it speaks as though users are still accessing these data from their institutions. And so we don't want to make the data inaccessible because, the pandemic has everybody working from home. But I think, again, you can just reach out to us and we can provide you more information on guidance on what, on how to access the data in the most secure way possible, and not limit you while we're going through the pandemic. So those questions have been coming up, and again, just email us and we're happy to work with you and guide you through the entire process from start to finish.
Thank you. Okay. Any questions so far about the scary flow chart, which actually does, you can walk through it. It's not so scary. It just scares me when I first see it. Okay, so the access requirements and all that info is on the website that Bianca showed earlier down at the bottom. Okay, so overview of application materials. In terms of the application materials, you'll have to list the name and affiliations of all your team members. The research plan that you submit to the data committee will need to discuss how the data will be analyzed and how you plan to disseminate the findings, including an agreement to submit draft copies of manuscripts and presentations. It will also require evidence of the research team's prior experience conducting research with tribal programs or communities, or of consultation if the research team doesn't have that prior experience. What do we mean by experience? So the researcher will need to show experience with evidence demonstrating that the principal investigator or a senior member of the team has prior experience conducting research with tribal programs and communities. So this evidence could be highlighted in a biographical sketch or a CV. So for example, in someone's publications, research projects, service on work groups or advisory panels, previous or current partnerships with the tribal community as documented by a letter of support, or other relevant activities reflecting work with AIAN communities. There's no single way of demonstrating this. If the PI or team doesn't have prior experience with research with tribal communities, the application has to describe the plan for engaging others with that expertise. So for example, engaging other researchers or tribal community members, and list their names, affiliations, relevant experiences, and how the consultation is influencing the research project. Okay. So we have a best practices document that's framed around AIAN FACES data, and it includes links to 2 required readings, as well as a list of additional optional readings. So I believe the 2 required readings are the NCAI Policy Research Center's Tips for Researchers, Native Youth Research, and the Tribal Evaluation Work Group's Roadmap for Collaborative and Effective Evaluation in Tribal Communities. That will all be in the materials.
Can I add something really quickly?
Yes.
Too much. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Okay, so one thing just to note that when we talk about the experience of the team, we often, even if you have a lot of experience on the team of working with, and you can demonstrate that experience of working with Native communities, we will still make the suggestion of, do you have a community partner that you can connect with? And that's one of the things we're offering. Would you like us to support connecting you with a community partner so that, it's not a requirement, you can get the data without that, but we will always recommend that. And that's, again, independent of your experience of working with a Native community. So does that I hope that wasn't confusing, or if that makes sense.
I think that's great to just show another way that we're trying to support that.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Okay, and this is an acknowledgement that you would sign, you know, that you have read, understand, and will aspire to the best practices, that the team has read the articles, that the PI and the team agree to protect the privacy and confidentiality of participants, and not to report findings at the individual, community, or program level. Based on the data that you'll be getting, hopefully it should be difficult to do that anyway, but there's never like 100% guarantee that somebody wouldn't be able to triangulate information. So that's kind of why that's in there, but we try and everything is de-identified. And again, some of the coarsening that we do is so that someone couldn't back out participating communities. And then there's this agreement to submit manuscripts and presentations, and have information in this annual report. Okay, so on this slide, you can see a list of the required application materials. After you submit your research and dissemination plan, the data review committee will have this one of two outcomes, which we talked about a little bit in the flow chart. So there'll be a letter stating that you've met the requirements. And again, with this now, Jessica, thank you for adding this sort of option. It sounds like perhaps either way to meet with the data committee, but if you don't meet requirements as well, there would be an explanation of why the requirements haven't been met. And hopefully the feedback will help the researchers to create a better research plan for use of the data. It certainly it's not intended to limit the researcher from applying again, like quite the opposite. So. And then for more information, you can go to the 2015 study page. You can also find out, again, some of the reports I was talking about earlier this morning, the data table reports, the webinars can be found on the ACF website. And then for questions about the research plan and submitting the plan, you would use that at acfhhs.gov email. Once you have the data for questions about the data, you would use that mathematica-mpr.com email. And that is all I have. Are there any questions that have come up along the way? Oh, Michelle, interesting. Michelle had a question, which was, could this agreement of collaboration and participation be referred to as community level consent? It's interesting. It's not active consent, I don't think, right? Because it doesn't get signed. Maybe passive. It's very detailed. I was looking at it the other day because we revised it for the new data collection. It's quite long, and it's this table of sort of 2 columns. Mathematica is going to do this and the community is going to do this, and we're agreeing to these, and each row is kind of a parallel topic, what we're going to do around data collection or whatever. That's a good question. I don't know.
Well, I always thought of it as that, not as like a literal consent form,
right?
But this came up yesterday, and talking about the process of getting tribal review in a given community, whatever that process may be, is akin to, if you will, an informed consent process at a community level, that the community knows and understands what at a community level they're signing on to. And I feel like that agreement of collaboration and participation sort of lays out all of those understandings that we want to make sure everyone's on the same page about. And so I guess I think I always thought of it as akin to that. So anyway, that's all.
Any other questions about, oh, go ahead.
I do want to jump in and just, no one raised this as a question, but this is something that we've received as a user question before, and that is, you know, if you have to send a letter to the tribal committee for approval, where do you access information on who you're sending this to? So again, some of that information was shared today, but I just want to point out that this email contact information is in the data application protocol. Again, you should be reading all of these materials, but I will acknowledge that email contact information is not shared across all of the different materials. So it's specifically in the data protocol guide. I don't think it's reflected anywhere on the city homepage, but that information is there. And I think we're also thinking about how to make that more visible for the 2019 data.
It does
So
often feel like things are hiding in various places because there's so much documentation for this. So thanks for adding that, Bianca.